What if the Red Army, famous for its grit and sacrifice, had been forced to fight Nazi Germany without the wheels that carried it forward? On June 22, 1941, when Hitler's Wehrmacht stormed across the Soviet frontier, the defenders stood on the brink of collapse. Factories churned out tanks and artillery in staggering numbers, but soldiers often marched on foot, and supplies lagged miles behind. Unknown to many, salvation would come not only from Soviet soil but from across the Atlantic. 400,000 American trucks that turned a lumbering army into a fast-moving juggernaut capable of striking deep into Europe. On June 22, 1941, when the thunder of German artillery shattered the dawn across the Soviet frontier, the fate of the Eastern Front seemed sealed. The Wehrmacht, spearheaded by vast armored columns, roared forward with a confidence born of earlier victories in Poland and France. The Soviet Union, caught in the chaos of purges and poor preparation, staggered under the weight of invasion. In those first desperate months, when cities fell in flames and armies were encircled by the hundreds of thousands, the question was not how the Soviets would win but whether they could survive. The tanks and artillery that Stalin's factories had produced in immense numbers could not compensate for a crippling deficiency. The Red Army lacked mobility. Troops often marched barefoot across muddy fields, guns were dragged by weary horses, and supplies lagged so far behind the front that offensives faltered before they could gain momentum. It was in this crucible of war that an unlikely lifeline would arrive from across the ocean. The United States, still neutral in 1941, introduced the Lend-Lease Act in March, a measure designed to provide material aid to allies fighting the Axis. At first, Moscow was skeptical, assuming its own industrial base would carry the burden, but the speed of German advances exposed a fatal weakness. The Soviet Union could mass men and machines, but it could not move them fast enough to stop a mechanized enemy. The first convoys of trucks, jeeps, and spare parts arrived through the perilous Arctic route to Murmansk, braving submarines, Luftwaffe bombers, and icy seas. What seemed like modest deliveries soon became a torrent. By the war's end, America would send more than 400,000 trucks to the USSR, an industrial flood that transformed the logistics of the Eastern Front. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who would later command the Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad and the final assault on Berlin, admitted candidly that without the American Studebakers, the Red Army could not have executed its sweeping offensives. These trucks, rugged and versatile, carried Katyusha rocket launchers that rained devastation on German positions. They hauled artillery through mud and snow where horse teams failed. They ferried fuel, rations, and ammunition across endless steppe, ensuring Soviet armored divisions remained supplied deep behind enemy lines. In a war fought over distances greater than all of Western Europe combined, logistics were decisive, and trucks provided the sinews of victory. The numbers alone are staggering. Each truck carried nearly 3 tons of cargo, and multiplied across hundreds of thousands of vehicles. This meant entire armies could be resupplied with food, ammunition, and fuel at a pace previously impossible. Where once Soviet divisions ground to a halt from lack of supplies, now they advanced relentlessly, sustaining momentum over weeks rather than days. This transformation allowed the Red Army to conduct deep operations, the hallmark of Soviet strategy that aimed not just to defeat enemy units at the front but to smash through lines, encircle forces, and drive far into the rear. The German army, stretched thin and fighting on 2 fronts, could not withstand this new mobility. By the time of Operation Bagration in June 1944, the impact of American trucks was undeniable. The Red Army launched a massive offensive that annihilated Germany's Army Group Center, capturing or killing nearly 500,000 men. Soviet mechanized units, riding in Studebakers and Dodges, advanced with a speed that stunned both enemy and ally. Entire German corps were cut off before they could retreat, their lines collapsing in days. The offensive not only liberated Belarus but also opened the road to Poland and the very heart of Eastern Europe. This kind of operation would have been unthinkable in 1941, when supply columns crawled along muddy roads behind retreating infantry. By 1944, mobility was no longer a Soviet weakness but one of its greatest strengths. Even Nikita Khrushchev, never eager to credit outsiders, acknowledged the decisive role of American material aid. He remarked bluntly that without Allied supplies, especially the trucks, the Soviet Union would have lost. His statement was not hyperbole but a recognition of the truth. Soviet factories excelled at producing tanks like the T-34 and artillery in vast quantities, but without reliable transport, such weapons could not be concentrated or moved quickly enough to exploit breakthroughs. The trucks gave Soviet commanders the flexibility to launch rapid counterstrokes, resupply mobile formations, and carry the war beyond the defensive struggles of the early years into the great offensives that shattered Nazi Germany. This reliance on American vehicles also underscored the paradox of wartime alliances. Ideological rivals, the United States and the Soviet Union shared little in common politically, yet on the battlefield their cooperation proved essential. American industry provided the wheels, while Soviet manpower and blood drove them across the fields of Europe. When the Red Army raised its banner over the Reichstag in May 1945, it did so not only with Soviet steel but with the quiet, unglamorous contribution of American trucks that had carried the army every step of the way. The admission of Soviet generals after the war was a rare moment of candor. They had fought and bled more than any other nation, losing over 20 million lives, but they recognized that victory had not been achieved in isolation. It had been forged through the combined might of allies whose cooperation bridged continents. The 400,000 trucks symbolized that bond, an industrial artery pumping lifeblood into the Soviet war machine. Without them, the Eastern Front might have remained a war of attrition, grinding slowly with horrific losses, perhaps never reaching Berlin at all. Instead, with engines roaring and wheels churning through mud and snow, the Red Army transformed from a battered defender into a relentless conqueror, rewriting the fate of Europe. By late 1942, the Soviet Union had endured more than a year of devastation, yet the tide began to shift. The Germans had been halted at the gates of Moscow the previous winter, but it was at Stalingrad where the Red Army proved it could not only resist but also destroy an entire enemy army. Still, the victory highlighted an enduring problem. Soviet offensives remained limited by the inability to move men and supplies rapidly once breakthroughs were achieved. Trains carried goods only to the railheads, and from there horses or men dragged supplies across brutal distances. It was in this critical phase of the war that American trucks began arriving in mass numbers, altering the tempo of Soviet warfare. The Studebaker US-6 emerged as the workhorse of the Red Army. Built in American factories and shipped by convoys through Arctic ports and the Persian Corridor, it became the foundation of Soviet motorized logistics. Unlike many Soviet vehicles, these trucks were standardized, reliable, and easy to repair. Soldiers praised their endurance in snow, mud, and heat alike. With them, the Red Army could finally link its vast manpower with the mobility required for modern operations. The trucks were not glamorous weapons like tanks or aircraft, but they were indispensable tools that held the entire machine of war together. At Stalingrad, the impact was already visible. Supplies could reach frontline units faster, enabling the Red Army to sustain the massive encirclement of the German Sixth Army. After the city's fall in February 1943, Soviet planners envisioned offensives on an unprecedented scale. The Kursk salient provided the proving ground. When Hitler gambled on Operation Citadel in July 1943, seeking to regain the initiative with a massive armored assault, the Soviets absorbed the blow and struck back with reserves moved efficiently by Lend-Lease transport. In the counteroffensives that followed, mechanized corps advanced with speed that would have been impossible 2 years earlier, cutting through German defenses and recapturing swaths of territory. The trucks also multiplied the firepower of Soviet rocket artillery. The famous Katyusha launchers, once cumbersome and limited in range of movement, now roared into battle mounted on Studebakers. They could fire devastating salvos and then relocate before German counter-battery fire arrived. This combination of mobility and destructive power made them feared across the Eastern Front. Equally important, the trucks enabled medical evacuation on a scale the Soviets had previously lacked, saving countless wounded who would otherwise have died on the battlefield. Such practical uses often mattered more than spectacular victories. They sustained the army's fighting strength day after day. Strategically, the greatest demonstration of mobility came with the 1944 summer offensive, Operation Bagration. The Red Army, supplied by thousands of American vehicles, launched a coordinated strike along a 1,000-kilometer front. Entire German divisions collapsed under the assault, not simply because of superior numbers but because Soviet mechanized units could maintain relentless pressure, advancing faster than the Germans could retreat. Within weeks, Army Group Center was annihilated. The advance liberated Belarus, carried Soviet troops to the gates of Warsaw, and destroyed the German position in Eastern Europe. Such a sweeping operation required more than courage and firepower. It demanded logistical flexibility that only motor transport could provide. The trucks also changed the Red Army's doctrine in practice. Previously forced into rigid positional battles due to lack of mobility, commanders could now execute deep operations, striking into enemy rear areas and sustaining the pace of advance. Supplies followed close behind, ensuring that breakthroughs did not stall. Armored spearheads no longer risked isolation. They were supported by convoys of fuel and ammunition. This transformation mirrored the German Blitzkrieg of 1940 but on an even larger scale, applied across distances that dwarfed Western Europe. The Red Army had turned its greatest weakness into a decisive strength. American vehicles were not the only contribution of Lend-Lease, but they were arguably the most decisive. While food, radios, locomotives, and raw materials all mattered, trucks gave life to every other form of aid. Grain and canned meat could be delivered to the front, fuel could keep tanks rolling, artillery could be shifted to exploit breakthroughs. Without them, Soviet victories would have remained localized, with each advance grinding to a halt once supply lines overextended. With them, the Soviet Union unleashed an unstoppable momentum that carried its armies to the very heart of Berlin. The consequences extended beyond the battlefield. Soviet generals, hardened by years of combat, admitted openly after the war that American aid had been vital. Zhukov emphasized that without Studebakers, the Red Army could not have carried out its operations. Khrushchev later confirmed that the war might have been lost without the influx of Western supplies. These acknowledgments did not diminish Soviet sacrifice. Millions had perished, and the Eastern Front bore the greatest share of bloodshed, but they revealed an often overlooked truth. Modern war is won not only by valor but by logistics. The 400,000 trucks symbolized the partnership that, however uneasy, allowed two very different nations to crush their common enemy. By 1945, as Soviet columns surged across Poland and into Germany, the roar of American engines echoed alongside the thunder of Soviet guns. The Wehrmacht, once unmatched in mobility, now faced an adversary that had mastered speed on an even greater scale. The trucks did not win battles by themselves, but they enabled victories that reshaped the world. In their absence, the Red Army might still have prevailed, though at far greater cost and with uncertain speed. With them, the march from the Volga to the Reichstag became an unstoppable reality, sealing the fate of Nazi Germany and ensuring Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe for decades to come. By the winter of 1944, the transformation of the Red Army was unmistakable. What had once been a force retreating under the blows of German Blitzkrieg had become an offensive juggernaut, capable of sustained campaigns across thousands of kilometers. Central to this reversal was the logistical revolution powered by hundreds of thousands of American trucks. The scale of mobility they provided made the Soviet Union's deep battle doctrine fully operational. Supplies, reinforcements, and artillery were no longer confined to railheads or left to the slow plodding of horse teams. Instead, divisions could be kept in constant motion, pressing the offensive without pause and denying the enemy time to regroup. This new advantage became evident as the Red Army pushed westward. German defenses, once formidable, now collapsed under pressure because they could not adapt to the pace of Soviet advances. Entire regions were liberated within weeks rather than months, and the coordination of infantry, armor, and artillery reached levels that rivaled and eventually surpassed the Wehrmacht's earlier campaigns. Behind every thrust stood convoys of Studebakers, Dodges, and GMCs ferrying fuel, ammunition, and rations. This capacity allowed Soviet commanders to exploit breakthroughs with relentless efficiency, ensuring that successes grew into decisive victories.